Welcome back, friends, to what I've chosen to call a history of rock and roll in film and rock and roll. You may call it what you like. Today, we're dipping deep into Elvis and only throwing around a few little bits and pieces about the John Carpenter element, but it'll be scholarly. It won't be super deep. This wasn't a super deep time for his career anyway. We covered some specifics of the production last time and some of my impressions. We'll get into more of those next episode. If you're here because of renewed Elvis interest as a result of the new film with Tom Hanks in it, I hope the film was good. I haven't seen it yet. I plan to. All right, let's talk one of my favorite filmmakers ever. Let's talk John Carpenter. From a book I found called The Films of John Carpenter by John Kenneth Muir, it says, with Harry Zuckman writing the music and director of photography Robert Hauser ensuring the film met Carpenter's artistic standard, John Carpenter's first union shoot went smoothly, and Someone's Watching Me, the film, gained Carpenter his Directors Guild of America card. Although he had a little trouble with the network standards and practices department about the level of violence he was allowed to depict in his television venture, Carpenter was pleased with the final results. Someone's Watching Me aired on November 29, 1979, and earned solid ratings. Still, there could be no denying that by making three intense thrillers like Halloween, Eyes of Laura Mars, and Someone's Watching Me in 1 year, Carpenter was providing the critics with plenty of fodder for their, quote, son of Hitchcock, unquote, theories. Interestingly, Brian De Palma would stage a virtual remake of Someone's Watching Me in 1984. This one entitled Body Double, starring Craig Wasson, and Melanie Griffith. Though 1978 was seen primarily as the year of horror and success for John Carpenter, it ended on a determinedly different note. The sky was truly the limit, and the young director who so deeply loved westerns, film noir, and all of Hollywood's classic genres was intent on exploring his abilities outside the slasher craze his film had ignited. I think it's a little early in the timeline to say that he ignited a slasher craze during that year. It took a little time to take off when it came to the products that we know as, you know, the bedrock of the slasher genre. That would be, you know, late 70s, early 80s. But, all right, fine. I'll get back to the text. And surprisingly, it was another television movie, this time a 3-hour miniseries documenting the life of rock and roll idol Elvis Presley. Since Carpenter had once written a Western for Elvis Presley called Blood River, the project was perfect. Carpenter also took it as a sign of good karma that Elvis had once played a character named Dr. John Carpenter in a 1969 film entitled Change of Habit, starring Mary Tyler Moore. Determined to make the biography of his hero absolutely accurate, John Carpenter enlisted the aid of a Presley bodyguard named Charlie Hodges. And he approached his new project with glee and a sense of fun. Let me pause there. I believe it's Charlie Hodge. And I had the sound of that man's name drilled into my head via the Bill Hicks bit, where he does his Elvis impression. Charlie Hodge, ladies and gentlemen, breathing my scars, my water. Charlie Hodge, my scars, my water. You can look that up if you like. I won't belabor it here. A lot of salty language, though. Now, I looked up Blood River. It's a film that was actually produced in 1991. It starred Ricky Schroeder, Wilford Brimley, and Adrienne Barbeau. Adrienne Barbeau notably showed up in more than a handful of John Carpenter's films around the late 70s, early 80s when they were romantically entangled. And Brimley was in The Thing. Ricky Schroeder, it makes sense that he'd be probably in this because it's a Western, and he was in Lonesome Dove around this time as well, like right before it, I think, based on John Carpenter's script. It says, from what I can find out here on Wikipedia, it was originally premiered on CBS March 17, 1991. And nothing about Elvis that I can discover But I do see a note on IMDb that it was originally written for John Wayne, not Elvis. If you want to watch it, there is a link on YouTube you can find right now. And yeah, Charlie Hodge does appear in the film playing himself. Let's see. Where was I on the text? If there's anything else to say about this. Elvis was written by producer Anthony Lawrence, and John Carpenter found that ABC TV gave him carte blanche on the product. Again, a situation that Carpenter found irresistible. Disney teen idol and former Lost in Space guest star Kurt Russell was cast as the king. As we know, obviously, from last episode. If you didn't know that, you knew it after hearing the last episode. And Russell soon became a part of Carpenter's repertory company, later to appear in the director's Escape from New York, The Thing, Big Trouble in Little China, and Escape from L.A. Russell's then-wife, Susan Hubley, was cast as Priscilla Presley. And I believe the information that I got when I recorded the previous episode was sort of the opposite of that. They met on the set making the film and got married. So much for John Kenneth Muir. I want to talk about Mr. Charles Bronson for a couple reasons. One of the first things I read that made me happier than hell while flipping through Peter Grolnick's The Unmaking of Elvis Presley, Careless Love, I immediately had to record myself reading on video and put on Instagram as a fun little thing about rock history that I just learned today that everyone else has to know. During the time around 1960 where Elvis was making a film called Kid Galahad, let's see, October 15th, Kid Galahad, the second in a two-picture deal, was a different experience from the one he had when he made the movie Follow That Dream. Once again, he was playing a kind of idiot savant, an instinctively gallant boxer, but without the comic touch or script of the previous film. He was unhappy with his appearance. His weight had ballooned to nearly 200 pounds. He was unmotivated. He was generally feeling put upon. The only consolation was taking boxing lessons from the former world welterweight champion, Mushy Callahan, who treated him with deference and for whom Elvis felt great respect. Here's the part that I loved, that I had to read on Instagram. He was stung, on the other hand, by the indifference of Charles Bronson, who played a part of his tough but kindly trainer. Bronson, one of 15 children of a Lithuanian-born coal miner and a combat veteran of World War II, made it very clear that he was unimpressed by Elvis's karate exhibitions. Elvis, for his part, indicated to Red and to Sonny too, now back from exile with no apparent hard feelings on either side, that he had no use for Bronson, whom he uncharacteristically dismissed as a muscle-bound ape. That's the Peter Grolnick account in the Elvis What Happened. There is a chunk where they have the whole Sonny awkwardness. There was there was either an accident or a bit of a dust up here. Let's see. Oh, yes, it was over a couple of girls they were partying with. I guess this is a little bit after they'd finished wrapping up on Blue Hawaii. And they're partying. The fellas in the crew are partying with Tuesday Weld, among other folks. Some gal named Kay that Sonny has kind of the hots for. Well, Elvis moves in on Kay. Elvis moves in on Tuesday, both, after Sonny tried to sort of score with each one and individually and was kind of making a little progress. So Sonny bails on that part of the room and scoots over to his buddy Gene, and they start talking about the girls and how beautiful they are and how good looking Tuesday Weld is. Presley can't hear what they're saying, but for some reason, he gets it into his head that Sonny is talking some shit about him. So he stops, hugging and kissing and fondling the girls. And he says, "What did you say, Sonny?" And Sonny obviously doesn't know what he's asking. He says, "God damn it, you said something about me and I want to know what it was." So Sonny gets embarrassed. He doesn't know what to say. He doesn't want to admit in front of both the girls that he was discussing which girl was more attractive to his buddy. Elvis gets up, walks over to Sonny, and grabs a bottle of Coke, and he says, "Tell me or I'll break your goddamn head open with this bottle." Sonny says, "You're not going to hit me with no bottle. I've had enough of this shit. I quit." Presley does the classic line. I don't know who said it first in public or who said it first on a television program or in a movie, but he says "You can't quit, I fire you." Sonny heads for the door. Elvis walks in front of him so they can keep shouting at each other, apparently. Then Sonny says he got punched in the face by Elvis. Says he didn't move. He didn't even feel it, but he could feel tears of emotion coming out of his eyes and said quietly, I didn't think you could do that to me." Sonny goes to his room to pack. Elvis goes after him. Tuesday Weld comes up to Sonny and apologizes for bringing the other girl, Kay, to the house in the first place since it caused trouble and cost him his job. Presley asks Sonny if he has any money and just gives him $200. He then says there's going to be more money for you coming from Vernon, his dad. So now obviously Elvis is feeling really bad about what he did, but he wasn't apologizing for it. He wants to know where Sonny's going to live and what's he going to do. Now he can tell, well, Elvis doesn't really want him to go. Sonny was firm. He says, "I told you I quit and I'm getting out." Elvis follows Sonny to his car with his luggage. It was a scene that was to typify, according to this book now I'm reading from, Elvis's behavior over the years: a blind rage, then striking out at someone he loves, followed immediately by regret, but there was never a word of apology. Perhaps he felt his apology came in the form of exotic gifts, and of course, there were many of those. 2 weeks later, the studio shooting for Blue Hawaii was being finished. Sonny went over to the set at Paramount. The guards didn't know that he was no longer working for Elvis, and they waved him through. As was the custom, when Presley put someone in cold storage, the rest of the boys followed suit. They were cool to him. I knew about it because I must admit that when one of the other guys had a flare-up with Elvis, I did the same thing. If you're on the outs with Elvis, then everybody puts you on the outs. It says the outer. I don't know if that's correct. I changed it to outs. Elvis came off the set and sort of slowed down when he came up to me. Gave me a big hello. And Sonny replies, "Hi, boss. How you doing?" And Presley, brings him into his dressing room, asks Joe Esposito to get out and leave them alone for a while. And Presley says, "Sonny, you son of a bitch." And they both start laughing. "It's me, a son of a bitch. It wouldn't have happened if you hadn't been drinking." "What do you want to do, Sonny?" he asks. "Well, I was thinking of hanging around and trying to get some work in the movies, but I know it's pretty hard." Presley just said, "All right, okay." The next thing Sonny knew was that Presley had got him in the Screen Extras Guild. Sonny says, "There's a long list of people trying to get in the union, but Elvis, being who he was, just fixed it straight away. He went out of his way to do a favor for me, even though we had had our flare-up. He didn't say he was sorry, but that was his way of apologizing, I guess." All right, I'm getting to Kid Galahad now. Sonny, by this time, is back, full member in good standing of the old mafia. He had to act as Presley's karate dummy a bit during the filming in Palm Springs. Red did some scenes in the boxing ring with Presley and took the usual falls. He also got a damaged eye when Presley poked a thumb in his face during one scene. It was the first time that Sonny and Red met Charles Bronson, whom they liked, both for his quiet dignity and for the masterly performance he gave. But, recalls Sonny, Elvis just didn't go for him. Oddly enough, the rift between them was caused by Presley's incessant desire to impress everyone with his karate. Today, Bronson is an accomplished karate expert, but the boys remember that in those days, he wasn't too impressed with Presley's physical performances between takes. Sonny recalls, he was a very quiet kind of guy, a loner, and he didn't think Elvis was that big a deal. Elvis hated this, and he was always putting him down. He used to call him a muscle-bound smart aleck and a muscle-bound ape. Just never stopped putting him down, although I never heard Bronson knock Elvis. Now, of course, having got into all this, I have to go into the index of some books and see how many times Charles Bronson shows up in the life of Elvis, according to his biographers. That seems to be mostly it, with one exception towards the end. The January through December of 1976 chapter or section of Careless Love, The Unmaking of Elvis Presley by Peter Guralnick. They talk about him retreating to his bedroom periodically throughout the evening. This is like during recording sessions and stuff that aren't terribly productive or fruitful. Took one member of the band or another upstairs to listen to gospel music, expounding upon numerology. Hold on that. Sidebar that. Put that in a little parking space on the side. We'll get back to numerology. There's a connection. There's a very, very stretched, thin connection I'm going to drag us back to the Elvis movie about. And gave them all a viewing of his collection of police badges. At one point, when he was alone in his room with Red and Sonny, he explained a plot he had devised to rub out all the drug pushers in Memphis. The session would provide them with a perfect cover, he said, laying out all the weapons with which they could accomplish the task. No one would even know they were gone. He showed them pictures of the principal dealers he had gotten from the Memphis police, along with detailed information about the territory they controlled. That's pretty heavy, Red said dubiously. He was bored with Elvis's fantasies and was not unaware of how close this particular scenario was to the plot of Death Wish, the Charles Bronson movie they had watched together many times. Now let's talk about Corey Feldman and numerology. Because numerology was mentioned in that chapter, I made two connections to Corey Feldman that some of you won't think is relevant. You'll just think that this is me taking an opportunity to, judge other people for activities and beliefs that I think are kind of douchey. Well, you might be right, but it's my show. Now, someone else's show that is very funny at times when I have listened to it illegally on YouTube is The Bonfire with Big J. Okerson and Dan Soder. And they have been a bit obsessed on and off with Corey Feldman's wacky antics in the modern day. And the numerology conversation popped up when they were listening to his audiobook of his autobiography called Choreography. And this also comes up in the made-for-television Lifetime film that Corey Feldman wrote and produced, so he called all the shots, about himself and Corey Haim, called A Tale of Two Coreys. And there's a revelatory moment in their young lives when they're playing football on the beach with their dads, these two Coreys just getting to know each other for the first time. And they find out they both have favorite numbers that are very similar. The numbers 22 and 222. Let's hear some stuff.
Is 22. I've always had a passing interest in numerology.
Oh, God.
22
He's 7 years old at the time. Who knows the word numerology at 7 years old?
I like playing football with my dad and numerology.
I'm pretty into the stars above. You know what else I'm into? Paleontology.
Yeah, dark science. I mean, some real, experimental chemistry.
I don't know. My dad calls me young Tesla, but I tell him, stop it.
Ascending currents, descending currents.
Kid stuff.
Microchips.
He goes,
taking apart and rebuilding computers, dancing with Michael Jackson.
Consciousness. Levels of consciousness.
Astral projection.
Space-time continuum.
Black hole stuff. Just real,
quasars.
Yeah. And everything they're guffawing about young preteen or early teens, in some cases, Corey Haim, Corey Feldman, applies to drunk, stoned on pills, totally into his own whatever is on his mind at that moment, Elvis Presley. That's how I feel. They both give me the douche chills. Here Corey expands on the reasons why he has the particular favorite number that he does, because it's the awesomest.
A master number, and sometimes called the master builder. It's somewhat sacred, even the most powerful of all numbers. I had never met anyone else with the same interest, and certainly hadn't met anyone else with a number so
close to his own. 22, 222, which Big J and Dan Soder make the point. It's not close. It's not close at all. It's off by 200 digits. This is the crap that dumb people get into when they need more things to think about, and they're a bit naive, in my opinion, especially if they've got a lot of money and people around them that, say yes to them a little bit too much. Now, I wouldn't be talking about this if that was the only connection I found to Corey Feldman. No, this movie, the Elvis movie that John Carpenter made, features a scene in high school where Elvis being super cool and not even saying anything when it happens, gets confronted in the bathroom and, attacked basically, and has to fight his way out of it fairly quickly. When Corey Feldman wrote and produced his own biopic, he had a scene in high school where two teenage boys confront him and attack him, and he fights them off single-handedly. Now, in the Elvis movie, it's basically him being called out for being kind of a prissy-looking boy compared to everyone else with their crew cuts. He's got, the big pompadour, and he's obsessed over his hair, which for the time is quite, long, and, wearing his sort of silk-looking pink shirts and things like that. Not being manly enough. And in the case of the Corey Feldman story, he has a couple of his peers confront him in the bathroom about, we hear you're going off and doing a movie in Hollywood, and he writes himself, rightly or wrongly, as being so naive. He's like, yeah, it's going to be really great. It's called The Goonies, or it's called Gremlins, or I forget what the hell, whichever one it is, or it's called The Lost Boys. And they're like, they laugh at him and they're like, oh no, we're being dicks to you. We're going to beat you up now because we don't like people that are moving up in the world and leaving our little school behind and think that they're better than us, even though you're totally innocent and you're just so talented that someone else is taking you away from this background in this community that we are going to stay in. That's what I'm taking as being the implication anyway. Good old Fell Dog. He gives one guy a little shot to the groin. Another guy, I forget if he karate chops him in the neck or he punches him in the face, but he does a quick 1-2 maneuver on both of them and runs out while a teacher just happens to be coming in wearing a sort of a V-neck cardigan, kind of Cosby sweater, or hanging with Mr. Cooper, not sweater, a vest like hanging with Mr. Cooper or Bill Cosby kind of thing. Although it's a white guy, and he's like, "What's going on in here?" And Corey runs past him. Camera pans away from the teacher as he gets closer to the bathroom stall where the two assailants are. They're still on the ground. Seconds later, unable to move, unable to walk because of the devastation of Corey's Elvis karate powers. Now let's move on to a game that I have created and have chosen to call Priscilla Presley Bingo. Now that sounds like something dirty on the face of it. Ha 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 ha. But it's not on the face of it. The name is not meant to be an allusion to anything nasty or defaming of her character. No. But I do want to talk about dirty things involving her and Elvis. So, apologies for anyone that's hearing me click right now. I'm a clicking on my stuff in my desktop. I have access via archive.org, and so can you, to a scanned text of various copies and editions of Priscilla Presley's autobiography, memoir, whatever you call it, and that came out in the 80s, and I believe late 80s, mid 80s-ish, around there. My first impressions of it were as a child, reading a comic strip called Bloom County, and it basically caught me up on a whole lot of politics and pop culture from the 80s that I was too young for when it actually happened. And I started reading it in like 1991, 92, around there, when I got into a bunch of other stuff that taught me the ways of the modern adult world, like Calvin and Hobbes. And this is one of the strips that has a character named Binkley. Michael Binkley is a small boy who is like all the small boys in Bloom County, fairly intellectual beyond his years, but for him, a little more prone to obsess over celebrity culture than other boys his age, and a bit more romantic. And his long-suffering father is trying to sleep while Binkley is reading from the book Elvis and Me by Priscilla Presley. Panel 1, he's quoting the book directly. "And then I moved into Graceland with Elvis. We were so happy. He dressed me up like a doll. Then we'd pass out from all the pills." Second panel zooms in on Mike Binkley with just framing it up just like the top of his head and the book, so you can see the cover, Elvis and Me, Priscilla Presley, and a picture of Elvis on it. "One day we were kissing and I said, 'Elvis, oh Elvis, take me to paradise.' His ebony eyes softened. He whispered, I'm I'm passing out, Scylla. Panel 3, the frame is pulled back to show the bed again with his father. Now his father, instead of having his eyes closed, has one eye open. Binkley reads the next line. Then I turned 14. Cut to final panel. Bedroom door is shutting and locking while Binkley is standing outside of it with the book on the floor and his head thrown back in abject fear and moral indignation at this rejection of his attempts, shouting, well, pardon me for trying to share a little fine literature around here. That was probably more than I ever knew about Elvis Presley for quite a while as a kiddo, as an older kiddo. The awareness, like I said, besides the National Enquirer sightings and things like that, the notion that there had been a tell-all book in the 80s that was quite sordid, and that, Elvis had married a 13-year-old girl and moved her in with him, or according to that little, comedy bit. Point is, now I would like to get into that book without purchasing it at all or having to flip through it physically. I'm just going to do a little game of bingo where I do a Control F search on the electronic version of the book and search for certain key words. I'm definitely going to try to look up the phrase, he dressed me up like a doll, just to see if that was in there. But the words I typed up the other day are as follows: temper, shocked, uneasy, embarrassed, sex, drug, and passed out. If we don't get anything good from searches for all of those, I'll expand the list. Let's start at the top with temper. Now, the word temper shows up in the book about 9 times. I'm not going to read all of them, but I'll cherry pick a couple that seem interesting. One chunk says, it was fun hearing his recordings before they were released to the public. He asked me what I thought of each song. And since I knew what the kids back in Europe were listening to, I felt my comments might be helpful. At least I wanted to believe they were. I really like the fast-paced ones, I said, like Jailhouse Rock. Why don't you record more songs like that? Those don't seem as much like rock and roll as your earlier records. Oh, these don't seem, excuse me. So she's saying, the new shit doesn't really slap us hard. Elvis shot a look of such pure disgust that I was petrified. God damn it, he snapped. I didn't ask for your opinion on what style I should sing. I asked if you liked the songs, that's all, yes or no. I get enough amateur opinions as it is. I don't need another one. He got up and stalked into the bedroom and slammed the door. Trying to regain my composure, I fought back tears. I was embarrassed and confused. What was wrong with what I'd said? How could that upset him so? Luckily, the boys had already left the table and were all doing odd jobs or were in another room. I didn't know if any of them had heard Elvis's tirade, but I didn't want to face them. I knew Elvis had a temper. I had witnessed it in Germany, but never before had he directed it at me. Slowly, I rose from the table, wondering where to go. Elvis's bedroom door was still tightly shut, and although I was sharing his room, I hesitated to go in for fear he'd start yelling. Not knowing what else to do, I sat down next to the albums and started going through them, pretending to look interested. Soon, I heard the bedroom door open and saw Elvis standing in the doorway. He motioned me to come over. Reluctantly, I put back the records and walked into the room, fearful of what he was going to say. He closed the door, sat me down on the edge of the bed, and to my surprise, began to apologize. I'm sorry, baby. What happened before really had nothing to do with you. I just finished that recording session, and it's pretty damn good compared to what they usually want me to do for these movies. He talked more about his last film, the storyline, the songs, the dialogue, all of which he thought were inane. I was beginning to understand some of his frustrations and dissatisfaction. I remembered our talks in Germany. Elvis had been proud of his film accomplishments before entering the army. He had talked hopefully about doing movies with more substance and fewer songs. Scylla, from now on, I plan to keep my singing career and my acting career strictly separate. He believed that he was capable of performing more demanding roles than he was getting, and to prepare himself, He still studied certain actors whom he admired, such as James Dean in Giant, and Marlon Brando in On the Waterfront and The Wild One. But I keep getting offered the same musicals, same storylines, he complained. And they're getting worse and worse. His biggest problem was that these films and their soundtrack albums were always huge hits. Shaking off his serious mood, he grabbed my hand and said, "Come on, baby, we're going shopping." That was Elvis's way of making up for his outburst, but it took me a little while to get over it. Now, that's a cycle that we'll see play out, or we have seen play out, depending on what order I arrange all my all my thoughts in on this episode. Elvis gets mad, makes a big deal, apologizes, goes and buys something for somebody. Now let's jump to another temper. This is page 105 of Elvis and Me. This is when she's 16 years old. She did meet him when she was 14, unlike the Bloom County comic strip joke, Although I was excited about the party, I couldn't help thinking that after New Year's Eve, I would have to leave. Elvis kept telling me not to think about it. I noticed that whenever I mentioned a problem to him, he'd just say, "It'll all work out. Don't worry about it. I've got enough to think about without having to worry about that." He always avoided problems. If I was disturbed or depressed, or if I felt we were becoming distant and wanted to get closer by talking it out, he avoided me or told me my timing was bad. There was never a good time. I once reproached him about the attention he was lavishing on the girlfriend of one of the regulars. She was very attractive. About my height, with black hair and a nice figure. She'd come into the kitchen where several of us were sitting. And Elvis, who was wearing dark sunglasses, began making comments like, "Boy, it's getting warm in here. Anybody else warm?" I was so upset, I left the room. I waited for him to go upstairs, and then followed shortly behind him. "Elvis, I have to talk to you," I said. "Sure, honey, what is it?" "I saw the way you were eyeing that girl. It upset me." "Look, woman," he said, losing his temper. "No one tells me who I can look at and who I can't. Besides, your imagination's getting carried away. I've seen her ass around here long before today." With that, I stomped out, slamming the bedroom door. I felt betrayed that he'd even desire another woman and was annoyed that he'd never admit it. I became obsessed and watched what Elvis liked, what attracted him, trying to be everything he ever imagined a woman could be, and more. The New Year's Eve party at the Manhattan Club started around 10 p.m., but Elvis timed our arrival a few minutes before midnight. We just had time to order double screwdrivers when the countdown began. Then we all sang Auld Lang Syne. As people shouted, "Happy New Year!" Elvis pulled me close and said, "Baby, I don't want you to go back. You're staying here. We'll call your parents in the morning." I was in such a state of ecstasy that I didn't notice what I was drinking. 4 double screwdrivers, all drunk through a straw. After 1 double, I was feeling high. After 4, I was reeling. I went to the ladies' room with Louise and stayed there for what seemed like hours, swaying back and forth in the stall, trying to get myself together. When we finally returned to the table, I tried to act as if everything was okay, but Elvis took one look at me and said, "Baby, we better get you home. You're in no condition to be here." He asked his friend, George Klein, the Memphis disc jockey, if he would take me home. What a gentleman! Take your best girl out 10 minutes before midnight or so on New Year's Eve when she's 16. You know, when you're a teenager and those things are important, big parties and stuff. And then get her loaded on double screwdrivers. Man, I'm pretty sure these aren't the modern day, depending on what city you're in America, carefully measured out double screwdrivers, depending on the scrutiny of the local liquor board and the cops. All right, let's go back a ways now. I'm not gonna do just a bunch of speculation and lascivious behavioral studies here entirely on this episode. I want to talk about the band again. I want to talk about the early days again. Talk about some important shows, some important business connections, and how they came about. Last time we talked about the appearance of the Grand Ole Opry and the appearance at the Louisiana Hayride. Let's talk about the October 16th issue of Billboard magazine, the same date as the first Hayride appearance by Elvis. There's a small item in the section by Bill Sachs called Folk Talent and Tunes. It announces Bob Neal of WMPS Memphis is planning fall tours with Elvis Presley, the Louvin Brothers, and J.E. and Maxine Brown. Now, the Louvin Brothers, if you don't know who they are, you can be forgiven. I highly recommend just looking up some of their tunes and maybe checking out any information you can about their life and career together. I think there is a relatively recently published definitive biography of them that can be looked up. I don't pretend that I'm like a scholar and an expert. I'm a dirtbag. I didn't hear about them until 2006 or so when I bought a Hank Williams III album that opens with a clip of their song Satan is Real. And after the album of the same name, look up Satan is Real by the Louvin Brothers and just take a gander at the cover of that Capitol Record album. It is breathtaking. And there was an episode of the Dana Gould Hour I heard about a year or two ago that he talked about the Louvin Brothers pretty extensively, and it was really entertaining. It's a fascinating story. They wrote a pretty good set of tunes between the mid 50s and mid 60s, I guess, before they kind of broke things off. Some of them were covered by people you've probably heard of. Emmylou Harris had a hit with If Only I Could Win Your Love in 1975. The Byrds, while Graham Parsons was in charge of basically taking them over and turning them into a country band, they recorded The Christian Life on Sweetheart of the Rodeo. I have been mentioning in no less than at least 5 of my episodes of the history of rock and roll and film and rock and roll that I'm going to release a Graham Parsons episode because of the movie Grand Theft Parsons starring Johnny Knoxville. And I still am. I did all the research for it over a year ago, except for finishing watching the movie for a second time. Now back to Bob Neal. So he had not had much personal contact with Elvis since he met him in July of that year at a little show in Overton Park that he played. He had gone out to see all 3 of the guys play at the Eagle's Nest several times. He was definitely impressed with the potential they had. He had never been involved in management, but he had been booking shows in and around Memphis for 5 years, doing local promotion for Opry and Hayride packages and promoting shows of his own in Arkansas and Mississippi. Anywhere within the 200-mile radius of WMPS broadcasting, he would obviously publicize these shows on the radio. He has an early morning program from 5 to 8, and then another show called High Noon Roundup featuring the Blackwood Brothers, Eddie Hill, and other hillbilly entertainment. Elvis had frequently attended those shows. So Neal calls up Sam Phillips, asks if the group had any representation. Sam said not really. Scotty was handling management for the time being, the guitarist. And the 2 guys, Bob and Sam, agree that maybe it would be worth having Bob Neal try some bookings out and see what happens. So Bob speaks to Elvis directly. Elvis seems agreeable to it, although he didn't have a whole lot to say, apparently. Scotty didn't have any objections that Bob Neal could see. He simply wanted to go back to just playing guitar in the band and, probably doing some more studio dates at Sun Records if he could. So there's some civic club and schoolhouse bookings that Bob sets up for November and December and around Mississippi and Arkansas. So places he'd brought shows before, plenty of time. So folks around there knew him and enjoyed what he was bringing around. Enjoyed him coming up to their stages and playing ukulele, apparently, and telling some country style jokes. And then October 20th, the Press Scimitar announces under the headline, Elvis Presley Clicks. Elvis Presley, Memphis, swift rising young hillbilly singing star, is now a regular member of the Louisiana Hayride Show. The Hayride specializes in picking promising young rural rhythm talents. And it took just one guest appearance last Saturday for the young Memphian to become a regular. Elvis, Scotty, and Bill then quit their jobs. With a little bit of trepidation, but, brave intentions, their boss, or Elvis's boss, Mr. Tipler, says, I hated to see him go. He and his wife would go see the band play at the Eagle's Nest whenever they could. But I could just see he was going places. I just told him, I understand that you can't work and stay out all night too. I've always been one that if somebody can benefit theirself, make more of themselves, I don't ever ask them to stay. Pretty smart guy as employers go. I'm sure we've all had bosses like that. Always keep the conversation turned toward them letting you go. Always imply that it's a great burden for them to allow you to leave their job. Elvis had a pretty great quote from his dad, Vernon, about this decision. He said, my daddy had seen a lot of people who played guitars and stuff and didn't work. So he said, you should make up your mind either about being an electrician or playing guitar. I never saw a guitar player that was worth a damn. Now, there's travel in the works. There's shows coming up, but the guys have like a week or two to hang around Scotty's house and rehearse and not be bothered with the old day jobs anymore, getting excited about attention that's coming their way. They have 2 nights at the Eagle's Nest booked Friday and Saturday, and this is going to be sort of a send-off for them before they start making waves elsewhere for a while, thanks to Bob Neal. Now, on the Friday night show, Bob Neal brings a visitor to the club. A guy named Oscar Davis, known as Baron of the Box Office, is described as a flamboyant 50-year-old veteran of the vaudeville, carnival, and country circuits. With his jaunty boutonniere and elegant cigarette holder, these are now the words of Peter Guralnick, his drawling Boston accent and his habit of fixing his listener in his gaze and focusing all of his considerable charm upon him or her, he could boast truthfully that he had spent more money than many millionaires ever made, which was one reason he was perennially broke. A true bon vivant, he lived up to the advertising slogan he used for every show he promoted, "Don't you dare miss it." That's all capital letters, of course. That was how he happened to be in Memphis at this particular juncture. Oscar had worked promotions on his own for years. He had managed and been associated with stars from Hank Williams to Roy Acuff to Ernest Tubb and Minnie Pearl. Just you and me, punk rock girl. And he established a model for the modern country music promoter because of his, impecunious ways. I'm going to have to look that up later. He occasionally found himself in the employ of one or another of his proteges on this trip to Memphis. So here's what I'm getting to here. Remember the part about the carnivals and the vaudeville and country circuits? He happens to be in Memphis doing advance work for Colonel Tom Parker, whom Bob Neal had originally met some years before in connection with an Eddie Arnold show at Russwood Park that Neal had emceed. The Colonel had since split with Arnold, whom he guided to unsurpassed heights in the country music field over personal differences and a question of artistic direction. So Colonel Tom Parker had put Eddie Arnold in pictures. He'd hooked him up with the president of the William Morris Agency, booked him into Las Vegas. That'll obviously come up again later in Life of Elvis. And it kind of controlled and supervised every little detail in Arnold's career. But Arnold wanted to get into television and out of the moving pictures. And he wanted to spend, according to Peter Guralnick, his own and the Colonel's money. The result was that in August 1953, Arnold fired his manager out of the blue. A bitter blow to Tom Parker's pride, but one that he was well on his way to overcoming with his recent signing of country's new #1 star, Hank Snow, to a limited partnership agreement. So, part of the terms of the severance he had with Arnold were that he would continue to book him on a regional basis and had set up a 10-day tour of the Mid-South in the fall of 1954. Memphis was date number 5 on that tour. Oscar had stopped by WMPS to cut some spots for the show that afternoon. And at the time, of course, asked Bob Neal what was going on around town. Neal has a lot going on around town and gives him the rundown of everything that he's got cooking right now and happens to mention this young singer named Elvis Presley and the upcoming tour that he's going to have him on. Oscar had heard about Elvis. Apparently there's a big stir about him, and he wondered if there might not be a chance to see the kid. Maybe he or Tom could do something for him. Neil tells him, yeah, the boy happened to be playing at the Eagle's Nest that night. Why didn't he and the Colonel just drive out together and catch the show? So they do, naturally. Elvis and Scotty and Bill, all thrilled to meet a larger-than-life character with stories of the big time and the glamorous world that they might only have read about in magazines. Magazines, Peter Guralnick notes, like Country and Western Jamboree and Country Song Roundup. So after the conversation between them all is over, Oscar Davis suggests that maybe a little trip on Sunday up to Nashville again would be good for, Mr. Young Elvis Presley man. And says basically, come to the Ellis Auditorium and see the show that I'm putting on and meet some people, maybe people that you think are pretty nifty. Elvis was especially excited at the prospect of meeting Eddie Arnold because he was always on the lookout for new talent. So the guys do 2 nights in a row at the Eagle's Nest, and then Sunday at 6 p.m., Elvis walks up the steps to the entrance. Ellis Auditorium. Show includes Minnie Pearl, guitar virtuoso you may or may not have heard of by the name of Hank Garland. There is a biopic about Hank Garland that is not well known or well advertised. I ran across it quite accidentally, or a couple scenes from it on YouTube while I was doing one of my Crossroads episodes about Steve Vai and shred guitar. Because in this period piece about a guitar virtuoso, Hank Garland, that is not all that well known, but wrote a bunch of very popular songs and played with a bunch of amazing country artists and pop artists at the time, Mr. Stevie Vai himself plays the part of Hank Williams Sr. And if you can't find the movie, you can probably find the scene that I found on YouTube of Steve Vai playing Hank Williams. Also performing there at the Ellis was a local hillbilly star named Eddie Hill, not Hank Hill, and the Jordanaires, who would factor into Elvis's career a lot later, one of his, favorite group of backup singers and harmony singers. And then a guy named Robert Powers, the world's smallest hillbilly singer. Elvis was instantly recognized at the box office by the guy working and handed his, will call tickets right away. He goes to sort of sit in the back of the auditorium in his pink shirt, attracting a great deal of attention. Black pants and white shoes as well. So when the whole show's over, Bob Neal goes and gets Elvis, takes him backstage, and he wanders around like someone who's very out of place and uncomfortable and a bit dazed at all the people he's seeing that he admires and wants to talk to, but doesn't know what to say anything to. He's introduced to Eddie and Hoyt Hawkins of the Jordanaires. He told him he really enjoyed the group singing. He said that while sort of mumbling with his eyes on the floor, nervously. But they said they enjoyed his singing too. They had heard his record on the radio and they were out in California. He sounded like a quartet singer to them, they said. Elvis blushed, fidgeted with his hands. He said if he ever got to the point where he had the kind of success Eddie Arnold had, he would like to get a group like the Jordanaires to sing with him. And he said if he ever achieved that kind of success, he would like them to sing behind him on record. Did Hoyt think that was possible? Hoyt said he was sure it was. They did lots of background work in Nashville. It was more and more popular nowadays. They'd love to work with him someday. Fucking great. That's nice. Then, after too long, Oscar seemed a bit anxious for them to get going over to a coffee shop across the street. So he and Elvis and Bob Neal could have a cup of coffee or a Coke or whatever. There's a heavy-set man in a rumpled, ready-made suit, as Peter Guralnick describes it, with a cigar stuck in his mouth, eyeing them briefly from across the room. Then he turned his attention elsewhere. Who was that? Elvis asked Oscar as they exited the backstage area. That, said Oscar, with a respectful but somewhat impatient gesture, was Colonel Parker. Now, let's talk a bit about the Colonel, Mr. Tom Parker, supposedly from West Virginia. In 2003, a book was published entitled The Colonel, The True Story of Colonel Tom Parker and Elvis Presley. This is written by Alana Nash. And there's an accompanying Smithsonian article I will post a link to that delves into the story that is unearthed by this book. I'll read what's on the flaps. Almost the only indisputable fact about Colonel Tom Parker is that he was the manager of the greatest performer in popular music, Elvis Presley. His real name wasn't Tom Parker. Indeed, he wasn't an American at all, but a Dutch immigrant called Andreas van Kujic, and he certainly wasn't a proper military colonel. He purchased this title from a man in Louisiana. But while the colonel has long been acknowledged as something of a charlatan, this book is the first to reveal the extraordinary extent of the secrets he concealed and the consequences for the career and ultimately the life of the star he managed. As Alana Nash's prodigious research has discovered, the colonel left Holland most probably because, at the age of 20, he bludgeoned a woman to death. Now that sentence, the way it's constructed, and the way that the author sort of presents things in the book flap anyway, and I assume throughout the book, I haven't read the book, but I'll post a link to it, so you can kind of flip through it yourself if you like. It is alleged because of where he was at the time that this crime took place and where he wasn't soon after. It is a story that is basically, well, who do you think did it? Like, he had some kind of probable cause, so we'll get into that. Back to the book flap quotes. Entering the U.S. illegally, that's true. He then enlisted in the Army as Tom Parker. But with supreme irony for someone later styling himself as Colonel, Parker's military career ended in desertion and discharge after a psychiatrist had certified him as a psychopath. He then became a fairground barker, so that's how we're tying into the other associates he has that know Elvis, working sideshows with a zeal for small-scale huckstering and the casual scam that never left him. And by the height of Elvis's success, Parker had become a pathological gambler who, at the same time as he was taking amazingly a full 50% of Presley's earnings, frittered away all his wealth in the casinos of Las Vegas. Personally, I mean, that kind of makes me feel pretty good about what I've read, and I don't know if I need to read the whole book. Like, that just kind of solves a few mysteries right there for me. As Nash shows, therefore, the often baffling trajectory of Elvis Presley's career makes perfect sense once the secret imperatives of the Colonel's life are known. Parker never booked Presley for a tour of Europe because of the dark secret that ensured he himself could never return there. That's not proven. That's alleged. Okay? He never booked him in Europe, presumably because he murdered a 23-year-old shopkeeper, which we'll get to. Elvis was still, even at his most famous, Elvis was still being booked to play out-of-the-way towns in North Carolina because the former fairground barker, who shamelessly negotiated as such even with top record company and film executives, knew them from his days on the circus circuit. And Elvis was trapped, playing years of arduous seasons in Las Vegas, 2 shows nightly, 7 days a week, until boredom and despair brought on the excessive drug use that killed him. Because for Parker, he was an open chit, C-H-I-T, which I'm not familiar with that term either, whose huge earnings prevented his manager's losses at the gambling tables being called in. And I think the Elvis What Happened book with the guys from the Memphis Mafia talk about that too, about Colonel Tom. Let's dip into that here in a bit. Now that's book flap jacket copy. That's not necessarily written by Alana Nash. That's probably written by her editor, her publisher, or whatever. So I'm not laying any blame. Again, haven't read the book, but not laying any blame at Alana Nash when it comes to the heavy implications that these allegations are just simply facts. For you see, I've come to my middle age in the post-truth era of information and reporting. And speaking of reporting, onto that Smithsonian article, it says, far from being born in West Virginia, Tom Parker was in fact a native of the city of Breda in the southern part of the Netherlands, the Nederlanden. He had been born there in June 1909, the seventh child of a delivery driver and his wife. His real name was Andreas van Kuijk, or Dries to his family. And as far as anyone could tell, he changed it to Tom Parker because that was the name of the officer who interviewed him when he signed up for the Army. Huntington, West Virginia, meanwhile, was a stop along the route of the carnivals that the Dutch teenager worked when he first came to the States. Parker, or Van Kuijk, had other secrets too, not least of which was that he was an illegal immigrant reaching the U.S. most probably through Canada. He had never been naturalized as an American either. His exposure as an illegal immigrant makes it easier to understand his deep reluctance to leave the States, or even, as he once confided in a trusted assistant, to pick up the check he had earned while working his passage from the Netherlands to North America. But his apparent unwillingness to solve what should have been a minor problem does not remain a puzzle. After all, the Alien Registration Act of 1940 had offered amnesty to all illegals, and when Elvis made it big, his manager made plenty of powerful new friends. By the 1960s, Parker could have placed a phone call directly to Lyndon Johnson to smooth out any problems with his naturalization. Now, evidently, somebody back in the hometown of Breda pointed out to a journalist who pointed it out to the author of the book, who pointed it out to whoever was writing the Smithsonian Magazine article online, that, if anything was to come to light about Tom Parker, tell them that his name is Van Kuijk and that he murdered the wife of a greengrocer on the Bochstraat. The murder has never been solved, but looking it up, researchers found out that he, on that very night, left for America and adopted a different name. And that is why it is so mysterious. That is why he does not want to be known. It turns out that through newspaper files, there had been indeed an unsolved killing in Breda in May 1929. Anna van den Enden, a 23-year-old newlywed, had been battered to death in the living quarters behind the store she worked at. The premises had then been ransacked in search of money, but supposedly nothing was taken. After that, the killer scattered a thin layer of pepper around the body before fleeing the scene. Apparently, that's something that people would do in hope of preventing police dogs from picking up their scent. Try it sometime. Let me know if it works. So it's implied basically that, he needed money really bad. He wanted to get out of the country, and he knew this woman who had just gotten married. There were people saying he didn't approve of the marriage, and he was angry at the woman for marrying this other man. He might have just decided he was going to rob her grocery store, but arrived at her living quarters under the pretext of them having just a friendly, discussion or whatever. And yeah, he could have been, he could have been the guy that murdered a woman out of spite for marrying another man. And then maybe it was that this made him decide he had to get out of town. Maybe he wanted to get out of town first, and then that was his plot. And the robbery went terribly awry. I suppose there could be more conjecture in the book, but it's 1929. The thing is unsolved. There are people that knew him that lived in that town, but you're still going on, conjecture, anecdotal evidence to imply who did what when. But still saying all that, I believe it. I would totally believe it. It's fine by me. Fine by me to put those pieces together, because it does logically make sense. That's why he didn't just take Elvis out to conquer the world. Now, going back to Elvis, what happened? I'm actually surprised to find that it's not just a tell-all book about the late days in Las Vegas, which is what I expected it to be. There is a whole sort of summary retelling of Elvis's career from the early days on up. I assume if I go back to the earlier parts of the book, there's stuff about his childhood as well, because that's what people would have wanted to know. But it does kind of compress the timeline when it comes to the Opry, the Louisiana Hayride, and the introduction of Colonel Tom Parker into Elvis's business life. And if you only had this to read, you would just assume that you wouldn't know all the efforts of the people that we've already discussed in the last episode and this episode. I'll quote from around page 125. Right at the end of 1955, Sam Phillips of Sun Records in Memphis was doing a good job in pushing out Presley's releases in the immediate vicinity. But Sam, who also had Jerry Lee Lewis, Johnny Cash, and Roy Orbison in his stable, thought maybe Presley was now ready for the big plunge. He went to Randy Wood, head of Dot Records in Los Angeles, with an offer to sell Presley's contract for $7,500, a giant sum in those days. Randy Wood was a good businessman. And that's for those days. This is 22 years before the book was published. That's not that long ago, but all right. As was Sam. But he thought that while Presley might make a few hot discs, quote, he was only a flash in the pan, unquote. Besides, explained Wood, he had a new hot property, a crooner who would last forever. His name was Pat Boone. So far, not wrong. I mean, I think Pat's still around, isn't he? But even as Randy Wood was saying no to Sam Phillips, Oscar Davis was singing Presley's praises to Colonel Tom. Although the Colonel respected Davis's judgment, he didn't make a move until Steve Scholes started to echo Davis's statement. Scholes was an old friend of the Colonel, says Red West. He had been an A&R man for RCA Victor. That is, an artist and a repertoire man. He told the Colonel about this here kid who was tearing them up on the Louisiana Hayride. The Louisiana Hayride operated on much the same basis as the Grand Ole Opry, except that it was performed and broadcast at Shreveport, Louisiana. I would assume that was supposed to be broadcast in Shreveport, Louisiana. Colonel Tom went to Shreveport and listened to Presley. The conversation was immediate, and so was his recognition of a vital factor about Presley. He was the only male performer selling what so many female performers sold: sex. Now, notice that. They're saying in this little timeline that Colonel Tom was at the Shreveport show, immediately started talking to Elvis and hanging out and getting along with him, and then we're just like off to the races. When I don't think there was any mention of Colonel Tom at all in that chunk that we looked at from the previous episode, talking about the trip to Shreveport and who they hung out with. And it was this show at the Ellis Auditorium, probably a month later, or I think, what was it? It was like between the 6th, or maybe it was only a few weeks. Yeah. Like between the 16th and the 30th. So I suppose for 1977, when no one's told Elvis's life story, a small detail, but thank goodness for Peter Guralnick and all the people that made things happen along the way that didn't get any credit until Peter wrote that book, or his books, or his various books that had Elvis stories in them. So, the book then goes on here to say, make a good point. Since then, of course, all the top rock stars have gone in on the act. But in those days, male singers were romantic, sad, heroic, inspiring, heartbroken, but they were never sexy. Colonel Tom met Presley and liked him at first glance. He liked the way he reacted to direction. That's important because we know he's been really shy. He's outgoing, but he's also unsure of himself in conversation with people he respects, right? He liked his dedication. And there was an added ingredient, which Colonel Tom was to exploit for all it's worth. While Presley on stage was a writhing mass of sensuality, off stage he was humble and polite. That contrast would prove to be dynamite. Here was a man, the girls would reason, who was always struggling to control the demon inside him. It was stuff that made millionaires of many people connected with the young truck driver from Memphis. The book also notes that people had erroneously thought Tom Parker was the one that got Presley his first big break on the Louisiana Hayride. Colonel would chuckle and say, "Boy, I got him off the Louisiana Hayride." Presley had told the Colonel how he and the Blue Moon Boys had gotten a thumbs down treatment from the Arthur Godfrey Show audition team. The Colonel looked him in the eye and said, "Boy, we'll have New York for you for money you can't believe." 3 months after Randy Wood refused the chance to buy Presley's contract for $7,500, the Colonel got his contacts at RCA Victor to buy the recording contract for $35,000. And people look back on this and they're like, oh, Sam Phillips, what a fool for selling out Elvis Presley's recording contract, right? But Sam took that money and put it into the other artists he had on standby and pushing their records, and then used the money as an investment in a Holiday Inn franchise. Used that to just make consistent profits and relax in some ways. I mean, he was still a very hardworking person. He's very, I think, by all accounts, obsessed with details and doing everything his own way, especially from a technical standpoint when it came to building things and working in a environment that he had fostered as far as like recording studios and stuff or whatever he was doing. Very hands-on. But at least he got, some stability away from the whole rock and roll hit singles thing that he had been working so hard on for a long time. And when it comes to like the racism issue that people like to bring up when it comes to Elvis, some of that does definitely stem from a lot of disgruntled R&B artists that were black, that were supportive of Sam when he didn't have these guys, these country western rockabilly white guys doing a more boogie woogie R&B infused kind of thing sometimes. And he just kind of stopped putting their stuff out. He stopped paying attention to them. He stopped fostering their careers. I mean, it's you could also say that, like, well, he put out their records. They weren't big enough hits. He found what he was looking for with the rock and roll when it came along with these white guys. I think there's room to hear all the sides of that issue. I think there's room for someone to say, hey, he's a struggling businessman. He tried to make people famous, and when he finally had some big hits, all of his hard work paid off. All of his innovation paid off. You don't have an obligation to keep working with people that you're not inspired to work with. And also, hey, those guys could go somewhere else, work for another record company if they've got the goods. I mean, that's how it is if you're an artist. A lot of other artists were more pissed at the record companies that bogged them down and shackled them to long-term contracts and gave them a bunch of crappy songs to sing that they hated and weren't hits. And then they slowly got broker and broker as they were, misutilized or underutilized and misused and got too old to have a hit. But, Sam's an eccentric guy, small business owner, very innovative, but also seems like to have, he has a personality that's right in line with everyone that you've heard about in the world of show business that people developed a strong emotional bond with and sought the attention or the direction and the approval of, almost like a father figure, and then would say things. I mean, I've read people say things about Sam that like, oh, he was going to pay me all this money and then it never happened. But I sure love him and he was always good to me. Stuff like that. They say these things about Vince McMahon. And I apologize for my long-suffering listeners that don't know anything about pro wrestling or hate pro wrestling. I don't necessarily love pro wrestling, but I love the history of it. I've not enjoyed watching televised pro wrestling in, a few years now. Let's take a quick break and then get on to some Sam Phillips background. Going back to Peter Guralnick for the narrative on this one, early Sam Phillips recording session, one of his earliest production sessions. I will not do Peter the disservice of reading it in my own voice because what he's presented here is just information, well told and well organized. And there's not much for me to rephrase, let's say. Or you wouldn't benefit from me rephrasing it in my own way, I don't think. On July 15, 1953, an article appeared in the Memphis Press Scimitar about a new group which was making records for a label that had just started up locally. The Prisonaires were the group. They had begun their career inside the walls of Tennessee State Penitentiary in Nashville, where they had come to the attention of Red Wortham, a small-time Nashville song publisher. Wortham contacted Jim Bullitt, spelled Bulleit, which I would always think was like Boulet, but every time I order the bourbon of the same spelling, people call it Bullitt. Only recently, the proprietor of his own self-named record company in Nashville, the Bullet label without the I, had a number one pop hit with Francis Craig's Near You in 1947 and had released B.B. King's first sides in 1949. And a recent investor in the new Memphis label, Bullitt called his partner, Sam Phillips, reported the Press Scimitar story, and he said he had something sensational. Phillips, who had been operating his studio, the Memphis Recording Service, since January 1950, had and has established a reputation as an expert in recording Negro talent, was skeptical until he heard the tape. This is from the newspaper. Then came the problem of how to get the prisoners for a record-cutting session. The newly appointed warden, James Edwards, however, was fully committed to the principle of prisoner rehabilitation, as was Governor Frank Clement, a close friend and fellow townsman of Edwards. And so on June 1st, quote, Bullitt drove the 5 singing prisoners to Memphis, the composer having to stay in prison. An armed guard and a trustee came along, the record company paying the expenses, unquote. The prisonaires arrived at 706 Union Avenue to make their first record for the fledgling Sun label, which, despite Sam Phillips' considerable experience in the record business, he had been leasing sides to the R&B labels, Chess and RPM, for 3 years now, and had made an abortive start at his own label a year before, meaning, so leasing, from my understanding, having done the Chuck Berry Chess Records episode a while back, Sam was recording stuff, but didn't have his own label ready to go yet, so he was basically letting Chess Records release them and sort of pay him either, I don't know if it was, I don't recall if it was like out of pocket or if it was just a percentage, like leasing. Maybe that means they paid out of pocket for everything that, and then they kept the money from what they sold, or maybe they released it, saw how much it sold, and then gave him a percentage. But eventually he would own them again, essentially. They weren't the property of Chess Records for the rest of their, existence. He got them back. And he had put out fewer than a dozen releases to date. They worked from 10:30 a.m. to 8:30 p.m., the article noted, until the records were cut just right to suit painstaking Mr. Phillips. Just Walkin' in the Rain came out about the same time that the local story did. It went on to become a hit, and the reporter, Chuck Porteous, had predicted it would. If nowhere as big a hit as it would become when Johnny Ray recorded it 3 years later in 1956. It was the song that put Sun Records on the map, though, and very likely, the item that captured the attention of Elvis Presley as he read about the studio, the label, and painstaking Sam Phillips, who had staked his reputation on a recording by an unknown singing group and a song whose plaintive notes Elvis heard reverberating over and over again in his mind and in his memory and on the air. Now, Peter Guralnick goes on to sort of speculate about, how come Elvis was one of the first most prominent people to come to the door of the Memphis recording studio. Why not, other singers around the area in that time? Well, he doesn't claim to know, but he thinks it may have something to do with the fact that Sun started out doing blues and quote unquote race music, which is what they called it back then. It may have been that the author says none of the others was as innocent or as open as a young Elvis Presley who could dream of success beyond the scope of his knowledge or experience. It's a question that I put to nearly every Memphis musician that I interviewed in the course of doing this book, but the closest that I got to an answer was that they simply didn't think of it. They were too caught up in other things, boxing, girls, playing the honky-tonks. Some of them made recordings of their own voice in a booth at the 5 and dime for 25 cents. They may have even harbored the ambition to get on the radio and become a star like Slim Rhodes or Eddie Hill, but it never seems to have occurred to any of them that there was even a possibility of making records, at least not here in Memphis. Did it occur to Elvis Presley? Perhaps. Perhaps, like so many things in his life, it was no more than, what's this word? Inchoate? I'm sorry, folks. I'm not going to look that up. INCHAOATE. Desire A vision he could scarcely make out, words that remain unformed. But it was a vision that he pursued. Now the book goes on to get into the earliest activities of young Sam Phillips and his older brother Judd, who was a singer as well as a broadcaster, and he would sort of foster the early broadcasting career of Sam Phillips, who bounced around through a few southern radio stations. And it seems to be the first thing that he noticed, or other people noticed, setting him apart from his broadcasting peers, was that sound was very important to him, not just performance not just professionalism as a broadcaster. These are my words. These are not out of the book. This is I'm sort of taking the implications from what I'm reading here. It seemed to be getting clearer and clearer to him by the time he opened the recording service that he had a lot more care and obsession when it came to the sound quality of recordings and energy and performance than the average person just making a buck on the radio. It was in 1950 he did opened his recording studio with the idea of providing a service and an opportunity for, quote, some of the great Negro artists, unquote, of the Mid-South that had simply not been available before. As word got around, wrote Press Scimitar's Bob Johnson in 1955, Sam's studio became host to strange visitors, and Sam insisted on plumbing that strangeness, no matter how sophisticated a veneer they might present to him at first. He recorded Cotton Patch Blues and slightly more sophisticated rhythm and blues, leasing the sides to the Chess label in Chicago and RPM Records out on the West Coast, and doing everything from recording bar mitzvahs and political speeches to getting the concession for the PA system at the Peabody and Russwood Park, the baseball stadium on Madison. He ordinarily worked no less than an 18-hour day, putting in a full schedule at the station, getting to the studio late in the afternoon, returning to the Peabody in the evening for the Skyway broadcasts, then back to the studio, where he might have left the Howlin' Wolf or Dr. Isaiah Ross, the discoverer of a cure for the boogie disease, in the middle of a session. It was not uncommon when he came into work, and I'm gonna quote this directly because I think it's important. It's really offensive. Got little children nearby. Skip ahead 7 seconds. It was not uncommon when he came into work to be greeted with remarks like, "Well, you smell okay. I guess you haven't been hanging around those niggers today." Oh, God. Jesus Christ. That is so repulsive. Okay. I read that like 4 times in the past month before I recorded this. I did not expect to have such a visceral reaction when actually saying it out loud. And I recently read about how Brooke Shields, when she was 10 years old, was photographed in the nude multiple times for magazines. And her mom was the one who, was in charge of her career while it happened. And in 1978, in the February issue of High Times magazine, she was described as a sultry mix of all-American virgin and whore by Ed Dwyer. It said in this article, she's a sweet temptation to all but blind men and eunuchs. She's sister, daughter, sex object, victim, lover, tramp. We can look forward to watching her fill out over the next decade. And it notes that she's been playing the prepubescent vamp since she was 8. That's the closest I felt to the revulsion that I felt just now when I was reading that little excerpt about Sam Phillips's coworkers. But can you imagine, like, that's an expected sort of welcome when you show up to work at a job where you're an established professional? I don't know. I'm not going to belabor it any more than I already have, but this is the kind of thing that I try to remember I don't try to remember. I try to remind people of because I'm a fucking obnoxious prick about it. Sorry, I used the F word when I told you to cover your kids' ears when I said something else. When I hear people talk about how ridiculous the portrayals of racist people are in modern day movies when they do some period piece about the 50s, the casual racism and the casual racism that still exists in the country, of course. I mean, now it's just all over social media. So I guess I'm not even making a good point here. Whatever. It's all confusing. I hate it. It makes me feel really gross. So to refer back to the crazy schedule that Sam is keeping, as you know, as laid out in the previous paragraphs before I diverted us, this strain just eventually led to him having a nervous breakdown. He was hospitalized twice at Gartley Ramsey Hospital, where he received electroshock therapy. It was, he said, the only time in his life that he was ever scared. I mean, I don't know that we can trust the recollections of a person that's had electroshock therapy twice that to definitively say that up through the first 30 years of his life, he had never been frightened before. Not trying to be cruel, but kids get scared every single day, multiple times. We all were. Maybe Conan the Barbarian wasn't after a certain age. Like maybe after seeing his mom and dad die, he was not scared of anything after that. But that's the only exception I'll make. So anyway, after that, he has a wife. He's got 2 boys. He's got no money, no real prospects. After all that work, after all that hustle, he's got a lot of faith in himself and his vision, his own energy to sustain, his ambition towards these goals. He decides to quit the radio station when Hoyt Wooten, his boss, made a sarcastic remark about his absences, meaning when he was in hospital for treatment. It's like most of us these days expect the decency of getting to take a day off to go to the hospital, and some insurance to help us pay for, the $100,000 it'll cost us to go in and get an aspirin or whatever the heck it is, let alone electroshock therapy. Mr. Wooten, he said, "You are a cruel man." And in June of 1951, he left WREC, that record station he was at, forever. He printed business cards that stated, "We record anything, anywhere, anytime. A complete service to fill every recording need." Now, the partner that made this happen with him was Marion Kiesker. She was 6 years older than Sam, very well regarded in Memphis as a bit of a radio celebrity, being a woman of culture, divorced at the time with a 9-year-old son, and she fell in love with Sam. And she and Sam put together the studio themselves with their bare hands, and he had specific designs about how everything was going to go. Now, we've only touched a little bit on the Priscilla and Elvis dynamic. Let's bear that in mind, though, as we read the words of Marion. He was a beautiful young man, beautiful beyond belief, but still that country touch, that country rawness. He was slim and had those incredible eyes. Despite some of the images that have been given of him, he was very, very particular about his appearance with touches of real elegance, beautifully groomed, terrible about his hair. He would talk about this idea that he had, this dream, I suppose, to have a facility where black people could come and play their own music, a place where they would feel free and relaxed to do it. One day we were riding along and he saw that spot on Union. And he said, "That's the spot I want." With many difficulties, we got the place and we raised the money. And between us, we did everything. We laid all the tile. We painted the acoustic boards. I put in the bathroom. Sam put in the control room. What little equipment he had always had to be the best. I knew nothing about the music, and I didn't care a bit. My association, my contribution, my participation was based totally on my personal relationship with Sam in a way that is totally unbelievable to me now. All I wanted to do was to make it possible for him to fulfill his vision. All I wanted to do was what would make him happy. Now, when Elvis comes by the studio, he comes in very shyly, stammering, very soft-spoken. She can barely hear what he's saying. And Marion looks up from her typewriter to ask, "Can I help you?" He asked, how much would it cost to make a 2-sided acetate? She said $3.98 plus tax. For another $1, you could have a tape copy as well, but he said no, he would take the cheaper option. She says, "We had a conversation which I had reason to remember for many, many years afterwards, having gone through it with every editor that I tried to talk to during the time that I was promoting him for Sun." So obviously, back then, she knew this was something special. He said, "If you know anyone who needs a singer." And I said, "What kind of singer are you?" He said, "I sing all kinds." I said, Who do you sound like? I don't sound like nobody. I thought, oh yeah, one of those. What do you sing, hillbilly? I sing hillbilly. Well, who do you sound like in hillbilly? Oh, I don't sound like nobody. Now to bounce ahead in the timeline, as I want to do quite often, and switch narratives, I wanted to dip into Johnny Cash's autobiography because I remembered reading it about 20 years ago and noting a couple of things he had to say about Elvis. He said, Elvis was already making noise in Memphis when I got there in 1954. And I think this is the time when he was trying to work. He was out of the Air Force, and Johnny Cash was trying to work as a guy selling appliances, you know? I think Roseanne Cash, his daughter, would famously say, you know, he would knock on someone's door and say things like, you don't want to buy a vacuum, do you? He was the worst. I guess he was the worst in the whole local company for selling stuff. Sam Phillips had released his first single, That's All Right Mama, with Blue Moon of Kentucky on the B-side, and it was tearing up the airwaves. First time I saw Elvis singing from a flatbed truck at a Cat's drugstore opening on Lamar Avenue. 200 or 300 people, mostly teenage girls, had come out to see him. With just one single to his credit, he sang those two songs over and over. That's the first time I met him. Vivian and I went up to meet him after the show, and he introduced us. He invited us to the next show at the Eagle's Nest, a club promoted by Sleepy-Eyed John, the disc jockey who had taken his name from the Merle Travis song and was just as important as Dewey Phillips in getting Sun music out to the world. Sleepy-Eyed John didn't like Sam Phillips, though. So while he'd always put Sun singles on the air, usually he'd preface them with some disparaging remark. Here's another Sam Phillips 60 cycle hum record, or this record don't belong on here, but you people asked for it, which was such a sorry thing for you to do. So here it is. 60 cycle hum is the sound you hear sometimes when these episodes cut to me playing guitar and there's a zzz before the first note plays. That's 60 cycle hum. It's just generated by, you know, someone else could explain it better than me, but it just happens with certain electric guitars when they're plugged into power and amplified. Some of you have heard me talk about guitar electronics on the show before, especially like the Crossroads ones about history of shred guitar, Steve Vai, things like that. I'll get into a lot more of it on the Jimi Hendrix episode that I've been not gutsy enough to finish recording for over a year and a half now. But the simple way to put it is the electric guitar sound comes mostly from pickups, which are magnets with copper coil wire wrapped around them. And you have volume and tone controls and a little switch you can flip to change the overall sort of tonality of the guitar. How bright and twangy does it sound versus how much softer and bassier it can sound, depending on how the guitar is sort of outfitted with those components. Originally, all guitar pickups created an effect called 60 cycle hum, which is like a background noise. Depending on where you're plugging in and whether or not the power where you plug in is sufficiently grounded, your guitar can get really, really noisy. So in, I want to say around 55, I think Seth Lover at Gibson created the humbucking pickup, but other companies had been working on something similar. But to demonstrate, I'm going to go from a non-60 cycle hum sound, what I've got two pickups together so they cancel out the hum in a humbucking fashion. And then I'll flip the switch and you'll hear the noise go from zzz to when I'm not playing notes. Okay, here we go. There, did you hear it? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Did you enjoy the fact that you tuned into an Elvis episode to hear me Play my ham-fisted versions of Ramones and Thin Lizzy riffs. Yeah, you're welcome. It's my show. But hopefully you heard what I'm talking about. There'd be a sort of a, then I'd click the switch and it'd go, zzz. That zzz is 60 cycle hum. So that's what a dickbag this particular DJ Sleepy Eye John was being to Sam Phillips personally and professionally, even though he was gaining a lot of enthusiastic audience members listening to his show from playing these Sun hits. Not hits yet, I guess, but for the local hits. So Cash goes on to say Elvis's show at the Eagle's Nest was a total blunder. The place was an adult club where teenagers weren't welcome. So Johnny and Vivian were two of only a dozen or so patrons, 15 at most. All the same, I thought Elvis was great. He sang That's All Right Mama and Blue Moon of Kentucky once again and again, plus some black blues songs and a few numbers like Long Tall Sally. And he didn't say much. He didn't have to. Of course, his charisma alone kept everyone's attention. The thing I really noticed that night, though, was his guitar playing. Elvis was a fabulous rhythm player. He'd start into That's All Right Mama with his own guitar alone, and you didn't want to hear anything else. I didn't anyway. I was disappointed when Scotty Moore and Bill Black jumped in and covered him up. Not that Scotty and Bill weren't perfect for him. The way he sounded with them that night was what I think of as seminal Presley. The sound I missed through all the years after he became so popular and made records full of orchestration and overproduction. I love that clean, simple combination of Scotty, Bill, and Elvis with his acoustic guitar. I know this narration is like the most not Johnny Cash sounding thing you ever heard. I'm not doing the voice. You know, I've never heard or read anyone else praising Elvis as a rhythm guitar player. And after the Sundays, I never heard his own guitar on his records. That night at the Eagle's Nest, I remember he was playing a Martin and he was dressed in the latest teen fashion. I think his shirt came from the National Shirt Shop where you could get something loud and flashy or something in a good rich black for $3.98. I did. Funny that $3.98, same price as that little two-sided acetate he got recorded at Sun Records the first time. But perhaps by then he'd started shopping at Lanksey Brothers on Beale Street. If he hadn't, it wasn't long before he did. I was in there myself 2 or 3 times in 55 and 56. Elvis and I talked about music, but I never spoke to him about Sun Records or any other connection into the music business. I wanted to make it on my own devices, and that's how I set about doing it. Now let's move on to our second round of Priscilla Presley Bingo. This time I'm control F-ing the word shocked. And I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 appearances of the word shocked in Priscilla's memoir. Page 18, it says, at her junior high, all these girls had Elvis t-shirts and Elvis hats, Elvis bobby socks, lipstick in colors with names like Hound Dog Orange and Heartbreak Pink. Elvis was everywhere on bubblegum cards and Bermuda shorts, on diaries and wallets and pictures that glowed in the dark. The boys at school began trying to look like him with their slick-back pompadours and long sideburns and turned-up collar. One girl was so crazy about him that she was running his local fan club. She said I could join for 25 cents, the price of a book she'd ordered for me by mail. When I received it, I was shocked to see a picture of Elvis signing the bare chests of a couple of girls, at that time an unheard-of act. Now, I could move on from here, but I want to take a minute to read from this next page because it sort of it gives you a picture of where Priscilla's self-image is at the time. And I think it does a pretty good job of setting up why she was probably so vulnerable to Elvis's advances by the time she was, 14 years old. She describes herself as small and petite with brown hair, blue eyes, and an upturned nose. Said she was always stared at by the other students. At first, girls would see me as a rival. This is whenever she came to a new school. She was an Air Force kid and shy, and she was desperate to be liked wherever she went and make a positive impression wherever she went as soon as possible because she just didn't want to deal with, being miserable. She said first girls would see her as a rival, that they'd, have to worry about her taking away their boyfriend, but she tended to just hang out with the boys instead. Probably the single ones because they were friendlier to her anyways. She claims everyone said she was the prettiest girl in school, but she never felt that way. She said I was skinny, practically scrawny, and even if I was as cute as people said, I wanted to have more than just good looks. Only with my family did I feel really totally protected and loved. Close and supportive, they provided my stability. Now let's jump ahead a ways to the second mention of the word shocked, about 70 pages later. I'm seeing at the top of the page, go back and do well in school and behave yourself. Maybe your parents will let you spend Christmas at Graceland with me and my family. I love the idea, but Christmas was 6 months away. Anything could happen between now and then. That night in bed, Elvis held me very close for a long time. I felt that he was doing more than just comforting me. He was telling me how deeply he cared. And more than that, his deep belief in consummating our love affair only in marriage gave me hope for the future. Later, our lovemaking had more feeling and intensity than ever before. Elvis wasn't going to let me go home without my taking a little of him with me. He didn't enter me. He didn't have to. He fulfilled my every desire. I want you back the way you are now, he whispered just before dawn. And remember, I'll always know. I smiled and nodded. I couldn't conceive of wanting anyone but him. Then there's a page break, and it says, Elvis didn't walk me to the airport. We kissed goodbye in the limousine. It was a tender but excruciatingly brief moment. I didn't think the pain could have been greater, even if he told me I'd never return. I walked onto the plane like a robot. I was in a daze that lasted throughout the 11-hour flight. I talked to no one, and I didn't care who saw the tears constantly streaming down my face. My world had come to an abrupt end. Finally, I closed my eyes, and in my mind, I relived every moment of my visit. Suddenly, the stewardess was telling us to fasten our seatbelts for the landing. The thought of freshening up before we arrived never occurred to me. I just sat in a daze, waiting for the plane to taxi to a stop. Then I listlessly gathered up my things and made my way out. When I first saw my parents, my mother was crying with joy at seeing me, and my father was wearing a big welcome home smile. But as I came nearer, their expressions changed from delight to absolute horror. My father turned away angrily. For a moment, my mother just stared. Then she reached into her purse, pulled out a mirror, and thrust it at me. Look at yourself. How could you walk off the plane like that? I glanced at myself in the mirror and immediately understood their response. 2 weeks before I had left them, a fresh-faced 16-year-old wearing a suitable white cotton suit and innocent of anything but a touch of mascara. Now, not only was I wearing the heavy makeup that Elvis liked, but my tears had smeared it all over my face. I hadn't bothered to lift a comb to my hair, which was unkempt and tangled. My parents were shocked and disappointed. So she looks like she just got plowed, I guess, is the implication there to her parents. Too embarrassed to look at them, I put my hand to my face and nonchalantly tried to wipe the residue of the mascara and liner away. Then I said, I'd like to go to the ladies' room. And her dad says, you'll go straight home. You've left yourself looking like this whole time. You can wait another hour to clean up. So then the next mention of the word shocked in the book, it says it was when she cut her hair. Elvis liked long hair. When I cut mine without asking his permission, he was shocked. How could you cut your goddamn hair? You know I like long hair. Men love long hair. He wanted it long and jet black, dyed to match his because, as he said, you have blue eyes, Scylla, like mine. Black hair will make your eyes stand out more. He made a lot of sense to me, and soon my hair was dyed jet black like his. The more we were together, the more I came to resemble him in every way. His tastes, his insecurities, his hang-ups, all became mine. For instance, high collars were his trademark, not because he especially liked them, because he felt his neck looked too long. He never felt comfortable unless he was in a customized high collar shirt. Though in a pinch, he'd turn up the collar up on a regular shirt, as he had when he was in school. When he told me that the collar I was wearing on a particular blouse was too small for my, quote, long, skinny neck, unquote, I too began wearing high-collared shirts. Why not? My sole ambition was to please him, to be rewarded with his approval and affection. When he criticized me, I fell to pieces. Now, the next instance of the word shocked showing up in the book is after she's gotten suspicious about the relationship between Elvis and Anne Margaret. Elvis blows her off by saying, you know, not much gets by you, does it, little one? For such a little girl, you're a typical woman. Elvis After the ordeal with Anne Margaret, I still suspected there were other women. Occasionally, I'd read or hear about Elvis romancing his latest leading lady. I'd see press release pictures of them riding down Sunset Boulevard on his new motorcycle, or hear about a new car he'd bought for a young starlet just before they'd started shooting a picture. There was always room for doubt. It was difficult to differentiate between gossip and fact, and I'd get crazed with worry. Before I started traveling with Elvis on a permanent basis, I discovered notes and cards tucked away on a shelf in his closet. Notes that read, "I had a wonderful time, honey. Thanks for the evening." Or, "When are we going to get together again? It's been 2 days and I miss you." When I voiced my suspicions, he denied everything and accused me of imagining things. Told me I was ridiculous for believing the gossip columnists, yet I couldn't help remembering that he'd told me the same thing when I'd asked him about Anne Margaret. So she, at one point, suggests going to hang out with him on the set of a picture he's filming with Shelley Fabares, a movie called Spin Out. And she says that every time she really challenged him, in which case he was guilty of something, his go-to recommendation was that she go home to visit her parents. Like in this case, she suggests, "Hey, may I come to the Spin Out set with you?" And Elvis says, "It would be a good idea if you didn't." She asks, "Why not? I'm not doing anything. I could come home and have lunch with you." Excuse me. She goes, "I'd obviously said the wrong thing." He shot me a menacing look and said quietly, "That's it, woman. I don't want to hear another word." It was foolish of me, but I didn't heed his warning. "Well," I persisted, "is there something that you're hiding that you don't want me to see?" He flew into a rage. "I don't have a goddamn thing to hide. You're getting a little too aggressive and demanding. It might be a good idea if you visited your parents for a while." Shocked, I yelled, "Well, I'm not going." "I think you should. In fact, I'll help you." He walked over to my closet and proceeded to throw every piece of clothing I had on the floor, hangers included, along with my suitcase on top of the clothes. "All right, woman, start packing." She says she can't believe this overreaction. It was one of 4 things that she can sort of break down. He was innocent, or I'd made him feel guilty, or he was guilty and I'd made him feel even more so, or it was simply his ongoing disgust with the inane plot of the film, and he'd chosen me as a target for his anger. So she's sobbing, starts to pack her stuff, walks out of the room. Moments later, he hears Elvis yelling for Joe, whoever that guy is, to make a reservation, get her on the next flight out. She's going back to her parents. After she hears the finality in his voice, she gets hysterical. She keeps folding up her clothes and packing until he comes back in the room. And she's sobbing uncontrollably. And Elvis says, "You're too goddamn demanding. Hurry up. It's time to go." So she gets up really slow, starts towards the door. And he waits for her to get right at the door. And he puts his hand on her shoulder, turns her around. And then she was suddenly back in his arms and he was holding her tight. And he said, "Now do you understand? Do you see that you need this? You need someone to take you right to this point and put you in your place." Priscilla says she was actually relieved and happy to be back in his arms. Anything he'd have said would have made sense to me in that moment. What I didn't realize until later was that this was Elvis's technique of keeping me under control. The next part of the book where the word shocked shows up involves her parents again. She's been living with Elvis for 2 years straight and traveling with him all the time. Her parents have been traveling around they went from Germany to Connecticut, and then they're moving from there to Sacramento. Priscilla's living at Graceland. She's excited to see her parents, but she doesn't like stepping away from the homestead, I guess. She says that she was well aware that her appearance in a tight form-fitting dress, spiked high heels, heavy makeup, with my hair dyed jet black and piled high on top of my head in a beehive hairdo would elicit, as usual, a less than delighted response for them. But I was determined not to change a single part of the total look that Elvis had painstakingly created. She flies up to Connecticut. I guess so. This is in between. This is before they relocate to Sacramento. And her expectations were correct. My parents were again so shocked when they saw me, they could barely speak. Later, my father told me that under all that makeup, my eyes looked like 2 piss holes in the snow. And then the final appearance of the word shocked in here is during the divorce proceedings in court, when she sees Elvis in the courthouse for the first time in a long time. She was shocked by his appearance. His hands and face were swollen and puffy, and he was perspiring profusely. Yeah, that's 2 rounds of Priscilla Presley bingo for one episode. I wish I had thought of this on the first one, but let us carry on towards the end of this with something I alluded to in the previous episode. A little something for me. All right, I warned you on the previous episode that I had chosen that one to read sort of an elegy of Elvis written by the great Lester Bangs, and that I would very likely be dipping into my other most favoritist rock and roll writer who's ever lived, and in this case is still with us, Nick Tosches, for another Elvis elegy, and definitely drew from Nick Tosches' writing on this episode in copious amounts from the book Country, The Twisted Roots of Rock and Roll, and Unsung Heroes of Rock and Roll. If you have the time and you need something to read about rock and roll, go get both of those. They're not very long. They're packed full of great language and great information and great historical value. Or maybe become a fan of Nick Tosches the way I did by listening to him being interviewed by Mark Maron on the WTF podcast. This was originally published in 1984. Elvis in Death. On Tuesday, August 16, 1977, I was sitting at home, which at the time was in Nashville, lost as was my wont in lazy midday broodings of duty, lucre, and dirtier deeds. The telephone rang and I picked it up. It was my buddy, Al Bianculli, a song plugger at Combine, the publishing company owned by Bob Beckham and Chris Christopherson. Al was and is one of the greatest admirers of Elvis Presley whom I've ever known. And there was actual distress in his voice as he spoke to me that day. "Hey," he said, "you're not going to believe this. Elvis is dead. He OD'd." He told me that Beckham's son-in-law, Chip Young, who played guitar on some of Elvis's recordings, had been set to leave for Memphis that morning for a session that Elvis had scheduled at Graceland. A mysterious call had informed Chip that the session had been canceled. Then, at noon, a second call had informed him that Elvis had been canceled. Less than 20 minutes later, after I hung up the phone, the news was being told forth with morbid excitement by every radio and television station in America. Elvis Aron Presley was dead at the age of 42. I shall never forget the thundering storm clouds that darkened the Tennessee sky that afternoon. As if the 4 last things descending to Memphis had rented the day in brandishment of their sovereignty. So that was his end. I was nonplussed. I had not known Elvis Presley as a man. I had never even met him. I started to realize that on some level of faint illogic, I had never truly thought of him as a creature of flesh and blood, but rather as an absurd effulgence of hoi polloi mythology, an all-American demigod who dwelt enthroned between Superman and the Lone Ranger in the blue heaven of the popular imagination. He had been so distant from reality. Even the Pope was more visible, more likely to grant an interview, that he seemed unreal, thus immortal. But now, less than 200 miles from where I sat, a pathologist prepared to make a large, Y-shaped incision in Elvis Presley's thorax and eviscerate the quite mortal organs from his cold remains. 5 days later, traveling east, I saw a sign outside a Baptist church on Highway 178 in Orangeburg, South Carolina. All that hip-shaking killed Elvis, it gloatingly declared. Snazzy dressers, too, those Baptists, I reflected. By then, of course, the world knew that hip-shaking had nothing to do with it. 13 different drugs were found in Elvis's system. Grim corroboration of sensational allegations that had been published less than a month before in an ill-written paperback called Elvis, What Happened? But that stupid, malicious sign, posted as it was in the shadow of the great wooden cross that stood before the church, set me to thinking about the matter of Elvis's fame and the nature of his death. It was an immense fame. In his own lifetime, his name was as immediately recognizable and as legendary as the names of Jesus, Caesar, Charlemagne, Shakespeare, Napoleon, and Einstein. And like those other names, he will live on. Yet, what was his crowning achievement? The source of his fame's enduring power? He won no wars, created no masterpieces. I hope that none among us will argue the depths of Heartbreak Hotel against those of Coriolanus. Those days are over. Made no great discoveries. Elvis was simply and supremely a singer, although he was, in the early days, popularly given credit for having invented rock and roll. This was, of course, not remotely true. Rock and roll was not invented. It evolved in the years immediately following World War II, while Elvis was still a blossoming schoolboy. Rock and roll, as fine as any that would ever be heard, was being made by Wynonie Harris, Amos Milburn, Fats Domino, and other less-known black recording artists. It cannot even be said in truth that Elvis was the first white rock and roll star. Bill Haley's Crazy Man Crazy was on the pop charts when Elvis, paying $4 to cut an acetate souvenir disc, made the first visit to Sam Phillips's Memphis recording service on a Saturday afternoon in 1953. No, Elvis did not invent rock and roll, but he was its avatar, the embodiment of its spirit and might. He was more than a star. He possessed the souls of his followers. Virgins burned for him, and boys strove to recast themselves in his image. He had charisma, in the true and Greek New Testament sense of that word, meaning divine grace. It was that grace, that mysterious, innocent power, that raised Elvis, the singer with no song of his own, the praiser of abject mediocrity, proclaiming at the height of his fame in 1957 that Pat Boone had undoubtedly the finest voice out now. From the merely mundane to the profoundly ineffable, he could have started a religion. In a way, he did. The years of 1956 to 1960 were the golden lustrum of his reign, when he was the god of teenage America. By the mid-60s, when he descended to the likes of Bossa Nova Baby and Do the Clam, he had become an embarrassment of sorts, a gaudy anachronism in a day of more momentous and sensitive pretensions. Though he regained respect at the end of that decade, and that new respect grew in direct proportion to the increasing abandonment of the New Age meatball mentality of the 1960s, he never again regained the magnificent success that had been his. His records in the 70s rose to the tops of the country and western and easy listening charts, but there was no more top 10 pop hits for the king of rock and roll, who had begun to recede into dark solitude and deathward ways, the curse at Blessing's End. But through all those years, though his following waxed and dwindled, the cult never died. This cult was almost of a religious sort. In the extreme, there were fanatics, mostly adult, middle-class males, who forsook their own identities and were born again in Elvis. These men, a few of whom I had the quite singular pleasure of meeting, lived vicariously through their idol, surrounding themselves with icons and sacred Presleyana, immersing themselves in the facts of his life, listening endlessly to the sound of his voice until that life and that voice became more meaningful than their own. They presented him with gifts, expensive guitars and such, and with vows of undying fealty, that his acceptance of these things might bring them, the adorer, and the adored closer, more intimately together. This odd religiosity was evident in lesser degrees of fervency throughout the saner majority of Presleyans. Like pilgrims to the Holy Land, they arrived in endless numbers of the two-leaved gate of Graceland, cherishing ever after the handfuls of gravel they picked up from his driveway. Small pieces of his clothing, such as those RCA packaged in a 1971 record album, were also treasured. Not unlike Brandia, the pieces of cloth blessed by the remains of St. Peter that were sold to Christians in the early Middle Ages. This was more than the frivolous devotion of fans to their idol. It was worship. And there falls the shadow of that Baptist cross. The crucifixion is the heart of Christianity, the center of its mystery and power, without which Christianity most probably would have died out, along with Mithraism and the other cults of the late Roman Empire. It is also the heart of another related mystery, the mystery of popular idolatry. When one man idolizes another, the hate and envy in his heart are as great as the love and respect of his outward homage. The idol whom the idolater would, but never can, be, is both the object of his adoration and the cause of his effacement and insignificance. So overwhelmed is the being of the idolater by that of the idol, that only the latter's supreme sacrifice, martyrdom, can justify and sanctify their relationship. Popular culture especially thrives on the self-killed. Fanatical fantasizers love to feel that Jean Harlow, James Dean, Marilyn Monroe, Jim Morrison died for them, Christ-like on the cross of reciprocal love. We now have entered an age when idolaters take a more active part in the process of martyrdom and canonization, thus John Lennon being blown away by a fan. As it has been said, the biggest mistake Bob Dylan made in his career was not to die in that motorcycle crash. And so Elvis, who had fallen from grace, who had not had a top 40 album in nearly 5 years, was redeemed. His old records sold out as fast as RCA, with pressing plants running overtime, could ship them. It don't mean a damn thing, Colonel Parker was rumored to have remarked about Elvis's death. It's just like when he was away in the Army. As sales rose on the third, I don't know how to do a Dutch accent pretending to be an American accent. Sorry. I probably should have listened to some tapes of the Colonel speaking, maybe. Who knows? Maybe I could have done it. As sales rose on the third day, the excitement, and it was excitement, of a decidedly perverse and hysterical sort, to be sure, waxed more and more ecstatic. Mourners lost their lives, crushed in the frenzied funerary convergence on Memphis. The cemetery tomb to which the dead king had been delivered by a Cadillac hearse, the color of the resurrection raiment, was defiled by thieves in search of grisly spoils, and the body was reinterred within the hallowed, guarded walls of Graceland. Like the 4th century impresario who hauled St. Stephen's coffin through Christendom, a holy huckster toured the South in Elvis's limousine, allowing believers to sit in it for a fee and to have their pictures taken in it for an additional charge. When I encountered him that fall at the Tennessee State Fairgrounds, he was also doing a brisk business selling photocopies of Elvis's autopsy report and death certificate. Morbid tribute records, euphony, flooded forth in waves of formaldehyde and glucose. One of these was Billy Joe Burnett's Welcome Home Elvis, sung as if by his twin brother, Jesse Guerin, who died at birth. The song warmly welcomed Elvis to the hereafter, where Mama was waiting for you, Elvis. Yeah, she's right over there. And soon our daddy will take our hand and we'll be a happy family once again. Eventually, there was a record called The Shroud of Memphis, celebrating the miraculous retention of Elvis's divine image, a la the Turin winding sheet. Sleazy weekly tabloids like the Midnight Globe and the National Examiner promulgated Elvitic Apocrypha. Among other things, there was foretold the coming of baby Elvis, who was to be born to a Midwestern virgin who claimed that she had been supernaturally impregnated by the spirit of the king. There were those stories that Elvis was not really dead, that he had faked his own death. These stories bore a striking likeness to the crucifixion theory put forth in Hugh Schoenfield's 1966 bestseller, The Passover Plot, and more recently in Holy Blood, Holy Grail. The ill-wishing cynicism of our time seems to be equaled by its gullibility. The Nashville entrepreneur Shelby Singleton cashed in on the fantastic notion that Elvis had not truly departed. He released an album, Reborn, by a masked Elvis imitator called R.A.I.N.N. Publicized as the risen Elvis, Orion was reputed to be a prophet who could make the blind see and the lame walk. Unfortunate cripples attended his concerts in the hope of being cured, and fanatics bought his records. There were, in time, 6 Orion albums, as if they were buying Elvis's own. The ultimate Elvitic text came in the form of Ilona Panta's Elvis Presley, King of Kings. The insinuation that Elvis was none other than the Son of God was also made in The Truth About Elvis, written by Jess Stern and Larry Geller. The equivalent of The Day Christ Died arrived in Neil and Janice Gregory's obsessive chronicle, When Elvis Died. Members of the Presley family also turned to the typewriter. There were books by Elvis's uncle Vester and by his stepmother Dee. Then came the carrion birds, those in whom hate and envy are more than just the mere and natural concomitants. Sorry, everybody. Concomitants, perhaps, of love and respect. Though such creatures hate omnivorously, their cowardice prevents them from preying on the living. For them, Elvis's corpse was the feast of the aeon. Popular press, its eulogizing done, cawed forth scandalous tales of drug abuse, violence, madness, and perversion. It is distressing that many of the books about Elvis published since his death, the most successful has been Elvis by Albert Goldman. To behold Goldman, a miserable little wad of failed manhood, gnawing in abject rancor at the crotch of a dead hero, is to be reminded of the depths of moral penury to which a man can be driven by self-loathing and greed. The fact that his ghoulish grovelings have made him rich does not speak well for the rest of us. Woo! I'm not even done with this chapter. I'm not even done with the whole thing. I had to pause after reading that sentence for the first time just now. Veneration has become desecration. When there was no more blood left to drink and no flesh left to eat, the feast was done. Now it is 1984. 7 years have passed since that hot summer day when the storm clouds passed over Tennessee. The long, mad spectacle of Elvis Presley's death is ended, but the Elvis cult is as strong as it ever was. The cult's principal shrine is Graceland, the Memphis mansion where Elvis lived since 1957 and where, on that August morning 20 years later, he died. There, in the meditation garden beneath a stone cross and a stone Christ, Elvis lies near his mother Gladys, who alone, of all her sex, was loved by the king. No other tomb in America is the object of so many pilgrimages as Graceland. Even the grave of her most beloved martyr, John F. Kennedy, is ill-attended in comparison. Day in and day out, they stream through the gates, their eyes wide, their cameras strung round their necks, middle-aged women in print dresses, their lizard-skinned husbands in tow. Children too young to know for sure why they are there, led by parents who were his disciples. Drifting now between lust and menopause, youth and their own less noticed place in the ground, skeptics and zealots, lunatics and the dull, ordinary grist of democracy. They come from everywhere to gawk in fascination at the grave of the American dream, to walk where Elvis walked, to touch what he touched, and to send postcards of death to their loved ones back home. The faithful bring flowers and tokens of their undying love. Housewives stand transfixed and dolorous before the tomb, like the women who kneel lost in prayer for hours at the sarcophagus of Pope Paul VI. You can hear me take a moment to do the calculation there? That's how long it's been since I was in school. Beneath the Vatican Basilica, like those prayerful women, they seem to be petitioning for divine intercession. Elvis was the supreme son, sacrificed on the altar cloth of maternal love and laid to rest by his mother's side. He was their son, the son of all motherhood. He died for them, they seem to feel. Younger women lavished the grave with less motherly affection. Some of them placed love letters on the tomb or floral displays bearing romantic sentiments. They knew him only in their fantasies while he lived. What mattered death to a love that had never been real? He died for them too, of course. He died for everyone and everything but for the drugs that had killed him. Teenage boys, enamored of death in their innocence, children of a later rock and roll culture, a approach the grave with delectation. Like Jim Morrison's numbered stone in Paris, it is for them a symbol of self-destruction, one of the sacred monuments of the rock and roll church of death. Some of the older males regard the grave as if it holds a kindred spirit, a good old boy like themselves, but one who got lucky and who paid for that luck with his life, just as they would doubtless have ended up paying if they had been lucky. For such are the ways of the Holy Spirit that wields the sword that moves them. Other men seem merely to be satisfying themselves with the fact that lies in the dirt at their feet. The fact that they are alive and Elvis is dead. His fame and wealth and wet young girls gone, with the breeze that is yet theirs to savor. How many towns in every kingdom hath superstition enriched? Exclaimed Robert Burton on the subject of holy shrines. Like much else in his Anatomy of Melancholy, this remark is no less trenchant today than it was in the early part of the 17th century. Burton surely would have been stirred by the instance of Graceland. The Graceland mansion was built in 1939 on 500 acres belonging to the Moore family. Though it was popularly believed in later years that Elvis gave Graceland its name, the estate had been christened by its original owner, Dr. Moore, in honor of his Aunt Grace. By the time that Elvis purchased Graceland in early 1957, the estate had been whittled down to its present size of 13.5 acres. Graceland is now owned and operated by Elvis Presley Enterprises Incorporated, a division of the Elvis Presley Residuary Trust, all the assets of which will soon belong to Elvis's daughter and sole heir, Lisa Marie Presley. Officially opened on June 7, 1982, Graceland attracted more than 520,000 people in its first year of business. The prices of admission are $6 for adults and $4 for children. Designated as a historical landmark by the Tennessee State Historical Society, Graceland has grown into one of the major tourist attractions in America. It has transformed the city of Memphis into a vacationer's mecca, enriching the municipal treasury and local economy with a steady flow of millions of tourist dollars. And again, we're talking 1984 millions of dollars. In death, Elvis is worth far more to his hometown than he was in life. Crass commercialism has always flourished around the major religious shrines of the world. Thriving souvenir shops surround St. Peter's Square in Rome. And similar commerce constitutes the only big business in the remote Pyrenean town of Lourdes. As far back as the 8th century, when the decomposing bodies of the early Christian saints and martyrs were torn apart to satisfy the international demand for holy relics, such merchandising was an immense and very lucrative industry. In his book, Western Society and the Church in the Middle Ages, Richard W. Southern states, if we were able to draw up statistics of imports into England in the 10th century, relics would certainly come high on the list. It is by means of such items that common men have always sought to bring themselves closer to the supernatural. Today, as in antiquity, relics, icons, religious medals, and the like are superstitiously used to ensure good fortune and ward off bad luck. The medieval farmer who believed that his possession of a blessed relic would result in better crops, and the modern automobile driver who feels that a St. Christopher medal will help protect him from accidents are in essence subscribing to the same magic. No marketplace of necrolatry can compare with that which is burgeoned on Elvis Presley Boulevard, directly across from Graceland. Ironically, this shopping center is situated on 11 acres of land purchased by Elvis in the 1960s. This property and the Graceland estate were his only land holdings at the time of his death. Here, in a number of jerry-built stores, one may purchase all manner of Elvis Presley mementos, souvenirs, and bric-a-brac. Vendors offer everything from T-shirts and license plates to crucifix-like pendants and plaster of Paris devotional statues. There is no telling just how much money is spent at this vast and tawdry bazaar of kitsch. One store alone, the Graceland Souvenir Shop, did more than $1 million in business in 1983. Much of the merchandise sold in the Great Mall of Death is developed and designed by Elvis Presley Enterprises Incorporated, which profits directly from its sale. I was told by one of the administrators that more than 1 million postcards are sold at Graceland each year, and that graven images of the king are, in general, the most popular merchandise. Though a court ruling has now disentitled him to share in the large profits of Elvis Presley Enterprises Incorporated, Colonel Parker's original appraisal has proved to be accurate. It don't mean a damn thing. It's just like when he was away in the army. Death has not hampered the marketing of Elvis. If anything, it has enhanced it. Elvis is more saleable in death than he ever was in life. The Graceland Shrine is more than just a monument to him. It is a monument to the majesty of the almighty American dollar. It is a temple of eternal revenue. A place where the thronging populace, the middle classes, can dream the dream of kings and taste the miraculous glory of he who died for them, providing, of course, that they have the price of admission. There are no free dreams. However we choose to look at Elvis Presley as a saint, a savior, or a monstrosity, as the apotheosis of America's fatal and garish yearning, or as the final god in the pantheon of the West, we can be sure the likes of him will not soon pass this way again. America heeds the call from his grave, where Jesus, Gladys, and Elvis form a new trinity, the Lord, the Mother, and the sacrificial Son of the dream. It heeds that call as it heeds no other. One thing is certain. In an age bereft of magic, Elvis was the last great mystery, the secret of which lay unrevealed even to himself. That he failed, fatally, to comprehend that mystery gives the rest of us little hope of ever doing so. After all, the greatest and truest mysteries are those without explanations. Well, friends, there's certainly more Elvis to cover next time, but there's nothing I can say after Nick Toshi's on an episode like this. Nothing that is, except I would love it if you would click the link tree or whatever link is currently in the description of this episode to support the show by either buying a couple shirts or leaving a donation on some sort of an app that I've placed there, or following me on Instagram at Just the Worst Ever, or following on Twitter at RockFilmRock. I honestly don't know how long I'm going to keep that one up. Maybe I'll get some more people to pay attention and communicate. If you want to send any Gmail to me, it's at Just the Worst Ever also. National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 800-273-8255. And the National Sexual Assault Hotline, which is R.A.I.N.N, R-A.I.N.N, is 1-800-656-4673. And if you like Elvis, but you feel guilty about not knowing enough about the black artists that paved the way for his success, well, I recommend you purchase the Nick Toshi's book, Unsung Heroes of Rock and Roll. I think it's the subtitle is The History of Rock Music Before Elvis. And then go check out every single artist that has a chapter in that book. Pretty sure if you buy their stuff, none of that money is going to them anymore, for so many reasons that you can read about in that same book. Until our next Elvis episode, or whatever episode you listen to next, please be good to yourself. Please be very kind to others. And if you don't have the strength to be kind, go home, go to bed. And don't ever forget, rock and roll is the best, and so are you. And I'm willing to tell people that on your behalf until I meet you and find out that I'm wrong. But now I leave you with the words of the prophet, the man who introduced the name Charlie Hodge to my consciousness, Mr. Bill Hicks. The world is like a ride in an amusement park, and when you choose to go on it, you think it's real because that's how powerful our minds are. The ride goes up and down, around and around. It has thrills and chills, and it's very brightly colored. It's very loud, and it's fun for a while. Many people have been on the ride a long time, and they begin to wonder, hey, is this real, or is this just a ride? And other people have remembered, and they come back to us and say, hey, don't worry. Don't be afraid, ever. Because this is just a ride.